Normalmente esta comisión lo que organiza es el ciclo Planeta Tierra y algunas otras jornadas, pero tampoco podemos dejar de aprovechar las oportunidades que nos brinda el calendario. El profesor Robert Whittaker viene todos los años con su grupo de posgrado, o sea, un curso de posgrado de la Universidad de Oxford, y disfruta de Canarias estudiando los distintos espacios naturales, las distintas formas de gestión y, por supuesto, lo que es nuestra biogeografía, desde zonas desérticas a la alta montaña, pasando por los ecosistemas forestales, subtropicales o macénicos. Lleva muchísimos años viniendo a Canarias, además colabora de forma habitual con bastantes profesores de la Universidad de Laguna, especialmente con José María Fernández Palacio, y han publicado juntos distintas publicaciones. Y esta oportunidad no la podíamos dejar pasar, de que el profesor Robert Whittaker nos diera una presentación sobre la visión de las islas y se trasladó luego en Canarias. Esperemos que todo salga bien, porque es la primera vez que en esta casa se utiliza la traducción simultánea, por lo que tengo entendido, y estamos haciendo un poco de innovación para que efectivamente podamos seguir avanzando con este tipo de personajes que creo que vale la pena. Rob, muchas gracias. Gracias.
Hola. This is a new experiment for all of us, trying the translation for the first time. I must apologize that I can't speak to you in Spanish, and that my voice is a little croaky today, as the students gave me their cold. I don't normally write a script, but today,
island that repeats itself. But he hesitated to identify the island at the centre, which has the impossible-to-know character of the mythical Antilia. His ideas have had a real influence in cultural studies, particularly of islands, and they provide a metaphor for us to reflect on what it means to be an island society, how much is unique to and generated within the island, product of its isolation, and how much is shaped by connectivity to other places and to other societies, and how much is exported to influence in turn those other places. Can we all hear at the back? Okay. Can you hear? Fantastic. So, next bit of technology. As an island biogeographer, a scientist whose interests are in the factors shaping the diversity of the living world on islands, I use a slightly different metaphor, from Darwin really, of islands as a series of natural laboratories, of model systems through which we can simplify and thus understand the living world and how it functions. I suppose we should begin by asking, what is an island? And an obvious answer is, it is a relatively small landmass surrounded by the sea. Biologically, this means that land plants and animals have to disperse over or through the water to reach the place. Now, not every species is capable of this, especially if the island is distant from a source of colonists. So islands are places of distinct habitat, surrounded by largely hostile environment to the island dwellers. Islands are isolated, and so they gain new members only rarely. By this definition, there are many types of system within continents and even within large islands that qualify. Mountain tops, lakes, forest patches within a sea of wheat field, and even submerged island seamount tops with their associated fish communities. All are forms of habitat island, and at some level we expect them to share similar biological features and to be shaped by similar processes. Not identical across all islands, but varying in predictable ways. considering proper islands in the ocean, there are many different types. A few, such as the Azores, are formed in association with the mid-oceanic ridges, where new plate is created, although only a few are formed in this context, as the water here is so deep, and where they do occur, there's often another factor involved, such as another plate boundary, as is true of the Azores, or, in the case of Iceland, as you see to the north here, it's associated also with a hotspot. Other islands are associated with subduction zones, where a chain of island forms as one part of a plate is subducted or pushed down underneath another. And the Caribbean provides examples of this. In hotspot systems, such as Hawaii, islands are formed as the plate moves across a more or less fixed weak point in the mantle where magma emerges to the surface. Each island, then, has a limited lifespan as it is carried away from the hotspot, erodes and subsides. For the Hawaiian system, by as much as 1 kilometre. The Canaries share this mode of origin, but not perfectly so, and here the oldest island, at 20 million years, is 4 times older than the oldest high Hawaiian island. Finally, there are continental islands, those formed on the lighter continental crust that forms most of the land area of the world. Some, such as Madagascar, have been isolated for a long time as they've been carried away as part of a plate fragment through continental drift. But most are like the British Isles. They are former land bridge islands, repeatedly joined to the mainland when sea level has fallen by around 80 to 135 metres during the ice ages. And these ice ages have occurred repeatedly during the last 2 million years or so. And they turn back into islands during the interglacial period, as you see in this animation. In fact, it is only within the last 400,000 years that the permanent land bridge connecting Britain to the continent was broken by a huge natural dam failure as huge quantities of ice melt pooled in the North Sea and eventually cut a deep channel through the centre of what is now the English Channel. Since then, Britain has been only joined to Europe when the sea level falls in the ice ages. When the current interglacial warm period began, it took millennia for the sea level to rise to drown the last connections through Doggerland, and so most colonists, plants, animals and humans were able to reach mainland Britain over land. And the final drowning of the area called Doggerland is thought to have been caused by a giant wave or tsunami triggered by a Yokelalp, a big collapse of an ice dam way to the north. Our isolation since then has been real but relative, never absolute, and throughout the millennia we have been culturally connected to Europe, even if sadly some of our politicians have adopted a mindset that doesn't recognise and value this. And I'm not going to say any more about Brexit tonight. I've picked out 5 islands or archipelagos for our discussion, and we'll use them to illustrate a few features of how island ecosystems are built, how they decline, and our role in this, and the importance of conservation on islands. And I thought to do this through a small selection of islands rather than one large helping. So the talk will be like a tapas of 5 plates. And I hope there is something of interest for everyone. Guam is, at 541 square kilometres, the largest, and with 100,000 people, the most populated of the Marianas Islands in Micronesia. It is as Tenerife is to the Canary Islands, although 1/10 of the people and 1/4 of the size. Geographically, these islands mark a plate boundary towards the west of the Pacific Ocean. As is true of all remote but populated oceanic islands, each wave of human colonization and connectivity has brought with it new forms of disturbance, and especially new purposeful and accidental species introductions, which we call alien or non-native species. Do please feel free to come forward to the front where there are some seats there. Now, the most notorious example of an accidental introduction of a predator and what it can do to an oceanic island is provided by this snake, the brown tree snake. A native of the Australasian region, it was introduced accidentally to Guam, possibly as a stowaway in military cargo soon after the end of the Second World War in the late 40s or early 50s. And by 1968, it had spread over most of the island. Its nocturnal activity, its ability to live in close proximity to people, and especially the wide range of prey consumed, lizards, rats, fruit bats, birds, enabled a demographic explosion with densities of 12,000 to 15,000 snakes per square mile, rather higher per square kilometre. And they became so numerous that snakes getting into electrical junction boxes became a major cause of power failures across the grid, costing between $1 and $4 million per annum. Prior to the arrival of the brown tree snake, the only snake on the island was a small blind thing which lives in the soil and feeds on ants and termites. The vertebrate fauna of Guam, having evolved for millennia without such native predators, lacked the usual defensive behaviour of continental forms, and brown tree snakes had them for lunch, and has driven many of these native and endemic species, endemics are those found only on Guam, to extinction from the main island, and for some, no wild populations remain. These losses include all the breeding seabirds, as well as 10 of the 13 species of native forest birds, the Guam rail, you see here, white-throated ground dove, Mariana fruit dove, Micronesian kingfisher, the Guam flycatcher, and the Micronesian kingfisher. Now, two of the extinct in the wild endemic species, the rail and the kingfisher, are being bred in the zoos in the hope that they can eventually be released back into the wild once the snake is controlled or eradicated. But losses include 2 native bats and 5 of the 10 native lizard species. Although the forest may persist in patches, the snake has initiated what we call a trophic cascade, resonating through the food chains and ecological networks. For examples, studies, just go back a moment, have shown that the seeds of this important tree species in the top right need to pass through the gut of a bird to germinate successfully, and other species have lost their pollinators, an example being Pisonia grandis, now rarely seen with fruit. Hence, important ecological roles and services naturally provided by birds and bats have collapsed. The ongoing ecological cascade on Guam demonstrates a general point that oceanic systems have evolved with a different balance of species and ecosystems from the mainland, and they are particularly susceptible to the combined effects of the many changes we bring, but especially to alien species, and especially top predators sourced from continental systems. Although here, I believe it's the bunny, the rabbit, that's the biggest problem. So this has turned out to be a rather bitter tapas. Can we make the filling a little sweeter? Well, perhaps this dead mouse might be part of the answer, although we would not want it added to our tapas. Dead mice baited with a common painkiller, which seemed to be safe for most native animals, but is toxic to the snakes, are being dropped from helicopters attached to a streamer, and the streamer gets caught in the branch of a tree, and the dead mice are taken by the snakes. This approach is currently being evaluated in a large trial to determine whether it might be possible to eliminate the snakes entirely this way. Other techniques include the use of Judas goats, which I can explain to you later if you like, or rat poison dropped by drones. Both have been used on the Galapagos Islands with some success, and conservation scientists have had to resort to such steps even though they would not really want to. Sometimes there is just no other way. And as my voice is a bit croaky, can I just check again how you can hear me at the back? Thank you. So here is a warning of how things can unravel on remote islands as modern societies get things wrong. It suggests that things don't always happen gradually, but can go catastrophically wrong in a few decades as some threshold crossing event happens. And you can see that islands have contributed 60% of recorded terrestrial extinctions in the last 500 years. So these are not encouraging thoughts. Let's look now at how ecosystems on islands build up in the first place to see if they behave more smoothly, gradually, and predictably. So what's up next on the menu? Well, the significance of the bird egg topping on this particular tapas will become clear soon enough. Surtsey was formed off the coast of Iceland by volcanic eruption starting 130 meters below the surface, and it reached the surface of the ocean on the 14th of November 1963. Its eruptive activity lasted only until the 5th of June of 1967, by which time it was nearly 3 kilometers square. And the island was named after Surtr, a fire giant from Norse mythology. Island people seem to like to name their volcanoes for giants and gods, and I can see why it seems to be a good bet. So this is Surtsey emerging. And since its initial formation, wave erosion has caused the island, it grew initially from that point, but its wave erosion has caused the island to shrink. And in 2012, it was already half the size, 1.3 square kilometers, that it had been at the beginning, with just 155 meters of elevation. Geothermal and geochemical alteration has toughened the core of the island, but in time, without further consecutive eruptions, it will erode back into the sea. Scientists have studied the development of ecosystems here in great detail, plotting the location of individual plants. All other visitors are banned, so we can study the natural process of recolonization unhindered. And as you can see, it was a slow process. The process of step-by-step succession of the vegetation was slow. The long, hard winters, short, cool summers of these latitudes translate into slow release of nutrients by weathering and slow biological processes. And although the first lichens, mosses, grasses and herbs were soon recorded, nutrients, especially nitrogen, which is fixed from the atmosphere, were limiting. Soil, lacking a mixture of clay and humus that can hold nutrients, was poor. The system seemed by the early 1980s to have stalled, as you can see from the flatlining on these graphs. And then something really interesting happened. In 1985, some lesser black-backed gulls began a colony which soon grew, so that by 1990 there were 6 seabird species, 120 pairs of each of fulmar and lesser black-backed gull, 35 pairs of great black-backed gull and herring gulls, 15 pairs of guillemots and a few kittiwakes. By the early 2000s, they've been joined by other species, including geese and land birds such as pipits, snow bunting and a wagtail. Collectively, visiting birds have been key dispersal agents, bringing many of the plants to the islands through their droppings. And as we've seen from the images, the quantity of plant life, the biomass and its diversity picked up too, and both properties have continued to increase, although even now, the difference between the plant cover inside and outside of the gull colony and the rest of the island is stark. The seabirds fish at sea, and in nesting and feeding the young on their island, they are responsible for a substantial nutrient subsidy from the ocean to the land. a massive and ongoing boost for the system productivity. It will take many more seabirds, maybe a big colony of puffins with their continual dependency on the sea, for the rest of the island to spin up to the same level and match with the biodiversity of the other nearby islands. So the lessons from Surtsey are, first, that ecological processes take time to spin up biomass and diversity in low productivity island habitats. Second, sometimes nature does make jumps, or at least she runs at different speeds after certain key thresholds are crossed. And third, while the current trend is upwards, the island lifespan is slowly trickling away as it is taken back into the sea by erosion. But in time, there'll be another island along, and the story will continue. So to the third plate, and it's slightly larger plate, perhaps of more substance. The previously dormant Krakatoa, halfway between Java and Sumatra, erupted for several months in 1883, finishing on the 27th of August with a gigantic sequence of eruptions. A flank collapse and an enormous explosive event in which 2/3 of the main island was blown away. This caused a huge tsunami wave to hit the mainland 30 to 40 kilometers away, carrying a Dutch steamer a kilometer inland, destroying infrastructure and tragically killing 36,000 people. The governor of Singapore thought a naval battle was underway, and he sent out the navy to see what was going on. The pressure wave travelled 6 times around the world. The 3 remnants of the Krakatoa group were sterilised and covered by 30 to 60 metres of fresh volcanic ash, mostly from so-called pyroclastic flows, like those that you see on much of the southern flanks of this island that the motorway cuts through. The subsidy of the sea, in this case, took a very different form. Early on, 2 pathways of plant colonisation were in operation. Inland, wind-dispersed ferns, grasses and herbs of open habitat soon colonised, but around the coasts, sea-dispersed species and fruits quickly washed up. For them, such an island is scarcely isolated at all, and soon they provided creepers, shrubs and even trees around the beaches. Some coastal plants, such as the sea almond, have a trick up their sleeves. Not only do their fruits float, but they also provide a reward for fruit bats. Their ripe fruits have a green, fleshy covering that is irresistible to fruit bats. So once this happened on Krakatoa, bats stopped off to feed, and in so doing, while crossing the straits between Java and Sumatra, they introduced seeds of other plants. And they soon had enough to be able to stay and not only bring in these seeds, but disperse them all over the island. Thus it was that the early grasslands gave way to forests reaching 30 meters tall and covering almost the entirety of the islands. All of this within 50 years of a blank slate of the sterilisation event. And here are some of the animals found on Krakatoa, including some of the dispersal agents here, pigeons and fruit bats. And there's another one, that's me, from a long time ago. And the monitor lizard, which is over 1 meter in length. The python, and a collared kingfisher. And so all of these species build up on the islands, and it happens so much faster than at Surtsey. Well, this is, after all, 6 degrees latitude, and the tropical forests on Java and Sumatra are lush, productive, and highly diverse. But like Surtsey, there was an initial burst, followed by a slowdown, until the trees began to form a forest habitat, providing homes for an increasing diversity of other types of species, of plants and animals. And now, over 100 years on, the system is still on the increase. As you can see from the curves on the left, numbers of plants and birds and butterflies all going up. At least this was what was happening until 23rd of December last year. You see, back in 1930, a new island, Chada Krakatoa, or Anak Krakatoa, emerged in the centre of the caldera that had been formed by the collapse of 1883. And you will know that the German von Busch first used the word caldera for collapsed volcanoes when writing about Las Cañadas and the Caldera de Taburente on La Palma. So it's a Canarian origin. Anak Krakatoa built over the edge of that collapsed caldera over the next decades to reach a radius of some 2 kilometers and over 300 meters in elevation. As it built, it also destroyed, dumping volcanic ash over 2 of the islands in the group, killing patches of trees and preventing the forests from maturing too far. But even so, as you can see here, forest formed on the edge of Anak Krakatoa itself. And at the time that this photograph was taken, in August of 2018, I think we'd recorded well over 150 plant species on that island alone. Finally, last December, the sheer height of the new volcano, perched on the edge of the old subsurface crater, made it unstable, and following months of eruptions, it collapsed. 2/3 of the volume of the island disappeared. Another tsunami was generated, and over 400 people on the mainlands of Java and Sumatra were killed. And although this was a tragedy, I suppose the only thing we can say is it was a much smaller event than 1883. In 2012, a group of geologists published a scientific paper in a peer-reviewed journal, arguing that such an event was increasingly likely as a result of the location of the active vent, perched on the edge of the caldera. Their forecast of the size of the wave almost perfectly matched what happened. Sadly, they had no way of predicting the timing of such an event, and no action was taken. After all, the volcano hadn't done such a thing in living memory, so what reason was there to go to the expense of a real-time monitoring system? And you can see some of the impact of the eruption on the group itself in this slide. There's a before and an after image, and you can see that the island of Panjang, which is the one on the far side of the screen there, is completely brown. So I studied Krakatoa for almost a quarter of a century, making many field visits to the islands. The lessons we draw from this work include the following. First of all, nature does sometimes make jumps, just as we saw in Surtsey. But the general pattern suggests a degree of predictability, that there are some underlying ecological rules for the way these systems assemble, based on the interactions between plants and animals as the ecosystem builds. Thirdly, it's reversible as the island erodes away or is subject to a new sterilizing eruption. In that sense, it may chase an equilibrium but never quite reach it. And this is what the smaller remnant of old Krakatoa, the island of Panjang, now looks like following the December eruptions, completely defoliated. All the life that had colonized, including many birds, the python I showed you, a pig, and many plants, will have been eliminated, or at least massively reduced, and undoubtedly many species extinctions have occurred from that island. Islands can be very dynamic environments. So that was another lesson we learnt. The tendency to increase in diversity over time by continued colonization of new plants and animals, plus in remote islands like these, by the evolution of new forms, is counterbalanced naturally by extinction. But the meeting point or equilibrium between these processes is not fixed, but varies over the lifespan of the island itself as it grows and declines, sometimes repeatedly moving the goalposts. This island of Tenerife over the past several million years has a similar wayward history. So, our next plate is one I find hard to resist. I like calamares. But from the outside, you cannot be sure until you bite into it what is inside the batter. I also have an indirect connection to Easter Island as my university tutor, John Flenley, who first led us to Krakatoa, worked on Easter Island, co-authoring an influential book, Easter Island, Earth Island. We call it Easter Island because of the day it was discovered. But long before the Europeans turned up, it was colonized maybe around 900 AD by those remarkable ocean voyagers, the Polynesians, who had their own system of reading the oceans and skies to navigate. And having colonized this far-flung outpost, the people of Rapa Nui transformed their island, deforesting it and causing rapid soil erosion and degradation of the island to the point of collapse, a narrative set out by Jared Diamond at some length in his book of the same name, Collapse. And here's the Polynesians voyaging. And this is a schema of that collapse, and I think I need to talk you through it a little bit. So the slightly heavier shaded boxes are the sort of start points. So up at the top, we have human population decline. We have in the middle human immigration, and we have a forest resource, and we have seabird resources. I don't know if I've got a pointer. I have a pointer. So human immigration, a forest resource, and a seabird resource. So people begin to clear the forest for agriculture and firewood, and then the population grows, and then they need more food, and then they exhaust more soil, and they need more land. Does this sound familiar? This is what people do, apparently. More people, and then maybe you get some warfare if there's too much conflict over resources and some crop destruction, and so more soil erosion, and maybe insufficient good land. And along the way, they developed this remarkable culture that I think everybody knows about, these moai, these wonderful statues. I knew it would go wrong. There we go. And they had to fell the trees and use them as rollers to move the statues along. And this causes the decline and loss of palm trees, and also maybe decline of fishing and rodents is going on, food shortage. So all of these steps, and I won't talk through all of these, so apologies to those of you who can't read it. But basically it's suggesting that one thing after another leads to the exhaustion of resources. And a part of this story was the fact that they introduced rodents from outside. So they collapsed their ecosystem. Now, my tutor, John Flenley, whose analysis of pollen in mud samples proved that the islands had once been forested, was shocked by the realization that when you stand on the highest point, you can see the whole island. And as these people could no longer make ocean-going canoes without the necessary large trees, and they must have cut down their last trees, they effectively trapped themselves on the island. The remarkable statues, or moai, carved images in worship of their ancestors, must have needed large numbers of tree trunks to act as rollers to move the statues around, while perhaps other plant parts were used to make ropes to pull them. Between the point the islands were first discovered by Europeans on Easter Day, 1722, and subsequent visits, the tipping point had been reached, and many statues were overthrown, indicative, it seems, of a rejection of the false gods who had failed them. And this, in essence, was the narrative constructed to explain Easter Island, and as a metaphor for our stewardship, it provides a chilling scenario of our complacency in managing our environment. Hence the title of the book, Easter Island, Earth Island. It is a warning because, after all, there is no planet B. But there is an alternative story to tell. Recent work by anthropologists and archaeologists provides a new and different narrative. When the Europeans first arrived in 1722, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, had indeed been transformed and most of the forests had gone. But the population had never built up to the very large size invoked by the collapse scenario. Rather, they probably regulated their numbers. They had refined horticultural techniques and use of scarce water resources, and other practices were innovative, fine-tuned and sustainable. The trick of using coarse stones as a mulch to limit water loss, as I've seen round the far side of this island, was an innovation they developed independently on Easter Island. What then caused the collapse and the resulting miserable state of the people witnessed on later voyages? Well, in large measure, it was caused by the introduction at initial contact of European diseases for which they had no immunity. Subsequently, in 1862, Peruvian slave raiders struck, capturing or killing around half of the surviving population. And they were taken to the Chincha mines to work on guano deposits. Back to seabird shit again. Most died of smallpox, dysentery, and tuberculosis, and an international protest erupted, even back then. The handful of survivors were repatriated. But the story does not end well. They carried disease back to the island, reducing the population to the point that the dead could not be buried. Similar stories of slaughter, enslavement, disease, and cultural genocide sadly can be told of many indigenous island populations. So few survived that their cultural legacy and oral traditions were largely lost, hence the difficulty of describing what happened from their perspective. It seems likely that the Polynesian rats had a significant role in preventing the regeneration of the indigenous palms, and undoubtedly, as with the Guanche people here on Tenerife, who inadvertently drove previously native oak and hornbeam tree species to extinction, as well as a number of birds and other animals. And undoubtedly they were careless of some of their biological assets. Seabird colonies fled the mainland. Degradation did occur, but the initial indigenous system of resource use that they developed on Easter Island was okay, and would probably have been much as it was in the 17th century now, had the island never been contacted by the outside world. According to this revised narrative, turning over the island to widespread feral animal grazing was a final big tipping point in the environmental degradation. And for that, the indigenous people of Easter Island were not responsible. So what lesson can we draw from Rapa Nui, from Easter Island? Well, lesson one, I think, studies across many island ecosystems, including Hawaii and these islands, the Canaries, show that the first colonists have often driven many native and endemic species to extinction. But we have to be very careful to review our environmental narratives to ensure that we're telling a fair story, whether as scientists or as historians, of how island societies have developed and interacted with their environment. I thought at this point I'd show you this slide, which shows estimates of critically endangered species, and number of plant species is on the left ordinate, and on the far side, the number of animal species and human languages, both expressed as a density for islands versus continents. So you can see that even today, the majority of endangered species in islands, or at least a disproportionate number of endangered species on islands occur on islands compared to continents. I'm sorry, I'm getting garbled here. I hope Sylvia has managed to explain that more clearly than I did, for those of you who are getting the translation. Lesson 2. Island environments are inherently fragile to contact with the outside world. Lesson 3. Each cultural wave to arrive on an island brings new challenges, introduces new species, changes things in different ways, and so island peoples have to be super smart about how they interact with the outside world if they're to look after their own environments. But as we've seen, the isolation of islands is far from absolute, and indeed, as you know, and as the island of Tenerife demonstrates, many island societies are, in the way that they function, highly interdependent on contact and trade with the outside world. So we come to the final plate, and it's an indigenous dish, even if the potato is from South America. The varieties are Canarian. And personally, I find them fairly irresistible. You might perhaps argue they should have come earlier in the meal, but I reasoned that you would know a lot about these islands and might prefer to hear more about some other places that we may compare to the Canaries. How many of these lessons might apply here, and what new insights are there to be found? The answer has to be some and many, of which we've time only to review a few. So, the Canaries. Although each island eventually sinks and founders, the Canary Islands are extremely long-lived for oceanic islands, and they are all true oceanic islands, of volcanic formation and never connected by land to the continents, not like a pretend island like Great Britain. The oldest island, Lanzarote, is about 20 million years of age, and the youngest, El Hierro, only around 1 million, with another new island waiting to form nearby. But before Lanzarote, there were other high islands stretching towards Europe, forming part of what we call Paleo-Macaronesia, indicating that this biogeographical subregion of the Azores, Madeira, Savage, Canaries and Cape Verde Islands, which share biological elements, have been in existence twice or 3 times as long as Lanzarote. They have been around so long that some elements of their flora, their plant life, have assembled millions of years ago, when the arrangement of land and sea and of major ecosystem types were very different. An example is the so-called rand or rim flora. The nearest relatives of these Canarian plant species were found in eastern and southern Africa, a few with occurrences also in northeast Africa. We now know that these species have assembled on the Canaries over an extended time period and through different routes and events as climate and environmental distributions have changed. In addition to the rand flora, the trees of your laurisilva, your laurel forest, are relics of the paleotropical flora of the Mediterranean region, which was eventually driven from the continent by climate cooling in the Quaternary, that is the last 2.6 million years. Many species have colonized the islands from old to young, from east to west. And amongst the birds, and with the exception of your endemic fruit pigeons, which are crucial dispersal agents for the forest trees, and which in one case have been in the islands for some 8 million years, most of your resident land birds have established more recently. Many have colonized from Europe within the last 2 million years or so, and have since evolved in isolation, sufficiently to become endemic subspecies or species. In the case of the blue chaffinches, recent work shows that the two forms, the Gran Canary form and the Tenerife form, the official mascot of your island, should in fact be recognized as separate species, making the Gran Canarian blue chaffinch the most threatened European bird species, one for which further habitat restoration is essential to ensure its survival. As I've written on this slide, the detail is not important of this very complicated graph, or set of graphs. It is just to say that it's based on multiple criteria, not just on genetics, that we classify these two birds as different species scientifically now. And of course, I'm sorry, a significant number of Canarian species have gone extinct since the arrival of the Guanche around 2,500 years ago, including a flightless bunting, one of only two known flightless perching birds, and a whole radiation of endemic greenfinches, as well as a giant rat, and it was a rather nice-looking creature, quite cuddly. This has been about 1 kilo in weight, this rat. And many of the surviving species, such as your giant Galotia lizard, has only recently been discovered and persists only in a small remnant of its original distribution. Here's a picture from a recent scientific paper of the skulls of some of the extinct greenfinches. So extinctions have been occurring since first human colonization. Those in prehistory are poorly known, but we are gradually getting to work out what was here through archaeological and paleo-environmental research. We know that extinctions are still continuing and will continue to occur even with conservation efforts. And we also know that many of the non-native species are proving problematic and will continue to be so. So I'm going to just end with something a little bit more to do with my own research. The islands here have a mix of very old relict species, those we call old or paleo-endemics, and a mix along with them of younger radiations or new endemics, neo-endemics. Many of those new species are found in special habitats such as the upper reaches of the Teide National Park, where a very high proportion are Canarian endemic and a few, like the Teide violet, are restricted just to the high elevation zone of this island alone. Some are very, very rare and some already extinct, no doubt. Now, around 10 years ago, working with a number of colleagues, including Professor Fernandez Palacios, who's here tonight from Laguna University, we developed a new model of island biogeography to describe how diversity naturally changes over time on oceanic islands, like the Canaries. We call it a general dynamic model because it embraces the dynamics of the islands themselves, the process of birth, growth, and death of an island, which is common to all of the islands we've reviewed today. In the Canaries, because we have a sequence of islands of different ages, each following more or less a similar trajectory, we can substitute the islands for one another, like a repeating island. The model predicts that when an island emerges from the sea, it takes a while to start up the ecosystem processes, just as with Surtsey and Krakatoa. But being more remote, larger, higher, with more habitats, immigration alone cannot fill all the empty niches. And nature does not like a vacuum. So the opportunity is there for species to adapt and to split into several new species through the accumulation of random mutations and through natural selection, so that they can exploit a range of unfilled niches and habitats. And this we can see with the Galotia lizards, the blue chaffinch, the plant genera Echium, Sonchus, and Aeonium, which are among many types of plants and animals that have radiated here. And so in the early to intermediate life stages of the island, there is a burst of speciation. I'm going to show this in a graphical form. The dotted line suggests that the carrying capacity of the island describes a hump-shaped form over time. Immigration is originally quite fast when the island first appears, and then declines as the available pool of species to colonize is reduced, as they've already arrived. Richness of species gradually builds up, but there's not enough in immigrating species to fill all the niches. And this leads to a burst of speciation, which only begins to slow down as the island does fill up and its own carrying capacity begins to reduce. Hence, eventually, extinction naturally, without our aid, becomes the dominant process as the island shrinks back into the sea. So as the island shrinks and subsides, there are fewer empty niches, and so the radiation of species slows down. In time, extinction becomes the dominant natural process, but slowly over many tens of thousands of years. Unless, of course, large flank collapses or other volcanic disturbances occur, which can cause instead bursts of extinction. In any event, by the time the island reaches old age, some of the endemic species have colonized the next island in the chain to start the process over again, thus outliving their island. So island species sometimes outlive the island on which they evolve. These processes result in a pattern like this if we substitute space for time, using each island as a model for a stage of the process. I'll just describe this for one of these graphs at the top here. This is for arthropods on the Canaries, and if you plot each island as a data point, you can see there's a hump relationship with island age and a linear increase of richness with area. So these two things combined give us the general dynamic model predictions, and it seems to work for quite a lot of oceanic island groups like this and for many different taxa. So that's the hard science done. So these islands are dynamic places with many features that are shared with other similar dynamic systems like the Galapagos and Hawaii, and they're very rich in endemic forms. To protect this biodiversity from unnatural rapid rates of loss and to conserve the natural heritage into the future, it is important to develop sustainable forms of land use and appropriate nature conservation steps. And here we can reflect that the Canary Islands have done what islands do biologically. They've taken an idea from the mainland and they've shaped it into an indigenous form, from which there are now lessons and ideas to export to other places. The Canarian Red Network of Protected Areas is, to my knowledge, the first fully developed protected area system established within Spain, and the first to apply the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Protected Area Management System, that's a bit of a mouthful, the IUCN Protected Area Management System, at the initial design stage of the Protected Area Network. And at least two of the people responsible for this are in the room here tonight. That you have chosen to place over 40%, I think it's now approaching 50 in Tenerife, over 40% of your land area into some form of protected area category is a bold step, showing belief that this can be made to work and that it is necessary to protect the unique natural heritage and culture of these islands. When I first came to Tenerife as an undergraduate student in 1980, believe it or not, yes, you believe it, I know I sound like I'm from that age tonight, if not older. It was to study ecological techniques and biogeography, but not to study conservation, which was not really happening here. But since 2003, we've been coming with a group of master's students from the University of Oxford who are studying a course in biodiversity conservation and management. We've been here a week, visiting protected areas and learning from the staff working in them. We do this now in collaboration with the Island Masters course from Laguna University. So I'd like to return to the thoughts of Antonio Benitez. I guess I appreciate my wish as a scientist to simplify the natural world, using individual islands as reruns of the same experiments, maybe in conflict with what we learn from studying island societies and cultures, of the complexities and the interdependencies and interconnections we can see with the outside world. By the end of the field course, I think at the least the students grasp that to fully understand island systems, we have to view them through the lens both of culture and of science. The students departed this morning. I'm sure an equal number of students arrive on each plane as leave. There must be a huge proportion of your tourist population at any one time who are students. But anyway, the students departed this morning with a new perspective on Tenerife and new insights into conservation in practice. Encountering your amazing island, its people, culture, landscape, flora and fauna, and particularly hearing from those involved in its conservation management, is the capstone, the final element of the teaching on the course. It is always inspiring to be here, and I appreciate the welcome and the opportunity that we receive each year, and the opportunity to be here tonight to speak with you, and the invitation to talk with you about island life. Thank you for listening to my croaky voice, and we have got a system that allows me to take questions if you ask them in Spanish, if I put the right earpiece in. So thank you.
Podemos hacer una serie de preguntas cortas porque se nos ha echado el tiempo encima, ¿no? ¿Alguien quiere preguntar algo, hacer algún comentario? No sé si se han asustado del tema o simplemente que lo ha dejado tan claro que efectivamente no... Antonio, ya me extrañaba. Venga, gracias.
Now I'm in trouble.
Yeah, about the model you were presenting, there was an increase in extinctions with the time. But you mean species that formed or endemism that...
The mic wasn't working. That one is.
Yeah. You mean extinctions of endemics or all sorts of species? Because at the beginning, the immigration, not the successful immigration, but the arrivals of life to the islands is almost the same as even later. The problem is they don't have the habitat, so they do extinct at the beginning in masses. The arrivals.
Yeah.
So I presume when you increase this line of extension, you're speaking of fixed natives or endemics.
Thank you for that question, Antonio. In the early stages of the colonization of islands like Surtsey and Krakatoa, we see a lot of natural turnover as the early pioneer species are eventually squeezed out by later species. With very remote islands, I think we get a different story. I think that there's so few arrivals that the natural rate of extinction is very low. And it's, in my view, more driven by the dynamics of the island than by the dynamics of the biology. And this is why we are invoking a gradual loss of species as islands sink back into the ocean. But many of those endemics that have evolved in the island are well adapted to them, and they may persist quite well into old age of the island. Except if you think of where so many endemics are on this island, they're in the high elevation environments. At least a good portion of your endemics are up in high elevation environments. So if the island is subsiding, you lose the habitat, and so you might lose habitat specialists at an early stage. But it's different, of course, from the susceptibility of endemic species to anthropogenic drivers of extinction.
Gracias. ¿Alguna otra pregunta o comentario? Pues señores, señora. Gracias, Rob. Espero que haya sido de interés para todos. Simplemente recordarles que mañana tenemos otra charla sobre los planes hidrológicos de las 7 Islas Canarias, y el próximo lunes tendremos a Luis López Avellán hablando sobre la estrategia marina de Canarias dentro de lo que es el ciclo del agua para afrontar las otras masas de agua que normalmente desde la tierra solemos olvidar. Muchas gracias a todos. Gracias.